A unicorn? Audrey repeated. She slumped down in her chair. Lyra nodded and took a seat on the bed across from her. I don't know how I originally ended up in Equestria, and that's where I lived, but that's what happened when I disappeared from this world. So, you've been hiding all this time? Is that you're a unicorn? I used to be, Lyra corrected her. I didn't even know I was actually human up until less than a month ago. Actually, been researching humans in my entire life, but Princess Celestia told me that they were real and that you still lived here. Audrey put up a hand to cut her off. No, just stop talking. Lyra shrugged. You wanted me to tell you the truth. Of course, I do want the truth. You're mentioning a few things about where you came from, and I don't think you were talking about... Didn't think you... my God, the way he writes. I don't think you were talking about unicorns. Audrey paused to recall something. Like, you mentioned that your mother worked at a weather station? Well, she's not a unicorn. She's a Pegasus, and she worked at the weather factory in Cloudsdale, specializing in rain cloud production. Audrey shook her head. No, that's just ridiculous. Are you saying you've just been giving me straight lies this entire time? I didn't lie. I didn't tell you the entire truth, but I haven't lied to you. Lyra glanced down at her necklace and held it out so that Audrey could see the Lyra-shaped charm. See this? This was a gift from the princess before I came here. What are you going to say? It's magic or something? No, that's not how magic works. I can't even do anything without a horn, Lyra said. I lost it when I became a human. Not that I really mind, since I have these. She held up her hands. Audrey almost laughed at her. You're sounding crazy right now. Do you realize that? I know it's a lot to accept. That's why I never mentioned it before. Besides, I don't want to go back to Equestria. I want to meet my real parents, not my human parents. So, the reason you haven't told me anything is because you're a unicorn, trying to fit into human society. Exactly. Audrey laughed weakly. You actually believe this? Lyra stared at her. Of course. I haven't been in the human world very long. I'm still adjusting to it. When I first got here, I was overwhelmed. Des Moines is just so much bigger than Ponyville. Ponyville? Audrey said. Yeah, it's where I used to live. That's... She couldn't even find the words. Never mind. You're the first human friend I've ever had. Up until I met you, humans seemed so distant. I didn't even think of them as being much like myself. I guess, but you showed me what we're all like. You taught me so much. I don't know what I would have done without your help. You were a unicorn up until I met you. Lyra nodded. That was the day I left home, she said. You believe me, then? Of course not. All this stuff about unicorns. It doesn't make any sense. I shouldn't even have to say this, but unicorns aren't real, Lyra. The words seemed like an echo, something she'd heard so many times before, but reversed. Lyra stared at her. You're just like Bonbon. Who? My old roommate. She never believed me either. Exactly. If she didn't believe you about unicorns, what makes you think I would? No, she doesn't believe in humans. Ponies think that we are just made-up creatures from other stories, from old stories. Most of them haven't even heard of us. I mean, even when there was so much proof that humans were real, all around us, even before I knew what I was. And that actually made Audrey laugh, though it sounded harsh. Lyra, I'll admit that this is one heck of a story. It almost makes sense that your dad would be a writer. You're definitely good at making things up, except her expression became sober. You still believe everything you're saying, don't you? Of course, Lyra said. The problem was just that she didn't have any proof. Even then, would it have been any made any difference? Bonbon's mind had never been changed no matter how much evidence Lyra had found. And she had been right. Princess Celestia had admitted to all of Lyra's suspicions, and now she was here with a living human. I never thought I'd have to convince a human that unicorns are real, Lyra muttered. Trust me, I never expected to have this conversation either, Audrey said. Please, don't mention any of this to my parents. I didn't plan on it. I just want to be a human. I didn't even want to tell you any of this in the first place. Good, because they like you, Lyra. They let you stay here a lot longer than I ever expected them to. If you start saying stuff about being a unicorn in Ponyland or whatever, Ponyville, whatever, the point is, they're going to think you're crazy, and they'd be right. Lyra was wondering why she'd ever said anything. She should have known this would happen. The human world really wasn't so different from Equestria, was it? Fine, she mumbled. We'll get in touch with your parents. Find out if they really are your parents. I think it would be best for you if you just have a permanent place to stay so that you can get back in touch with reality. Just one thing, Lyra said, holding up a finger. You know what unicorns are, right? Of course. But I don't see... How do you know what they are? Well, there's stories about them, but they're all fantasy. They're just made up, Audrey said. Lyra, if this is about what your dad writes about, he'd probably be the first to tell you it's all. We had a few stories about humans in Equestria. Not very many, but they were there. If you looked for them, that's because humans exist. And all those stories were based on fact. Audrey put a hand to her face. That probably sounds like a logical argument to you, but it really doesn't hold any ground. I don't know much about what our worlds have in common, but there are so many things I've noticed that line up. We even know what France is in Equestria, even though most ponies don't realize it's a real place, Lyra said. They'd hardly believe that I'd gone there. When did you go to France? You're from Pennsylvania, or at least we think you are, Audrey said. Lyra tilted her head. But you told me Des Moines was French. We're in America. There are plenty of foreign words here. Wait, where? Lyra stared at her feet. But I've never heard of America before. That wasn't in any of the equestrian histories that I read. God damn it. You've never heard of America? Audrey said. She shook her head and stood up. Lyra, you're really going to need to get help. Look, I'll figure out how to get in touch with your dad. You just, I don't know, let me handle this. Lyra returned to the guest bedroom, collapsed on the bed, and stared up at the ceiling. Initially she hadn't planned on telling any humans about Equestria. There were a number of reasons for that. She wanted to fit in, like she had always been a part of this world instead of having been yanked out of it all those years ago. She also didn't want to have to explain that. Where she came from, the species that had covered this world had caused its own extinction. And there was also the fact that she had no proof that another world existed, and humans would likely call her crazy for suggesting it. Sure enough, that had been it. Audrey didn't even believe in unicorns. This was too much like what had happened during her last week in Ponyville. Bonbon had thought she was crazy and wanted her to drop the whole human thing, so Lyra had shut up about it. It had calmed things down, but it had been hard. The evidence had been everywhere in Equestria, and of course it had. Humans had lived there once. They'd left their inventions, and then they'd gone extinct. She still hadn't mentioned that part to Audrey. That war was even harder to think about now that she considered herself more human than pony. Then again, her life in Equestria felt like another life, and at the same time it seemed like she'd only just been there yesterday. Mention that part. Crap. I'm sorry, Pony. Then again, her life in Equestria felt like another life, and at the same time it seemed like she'd only just been there yesterday. Lyra was used to sitting down to dinner every night with Audrey and her family, but when she thought about staying in this house with creatures that she'd worked so hard simply to prove the existence of, It still amazed her. They'd all gone their whole lives without seeing unicorns, though, and whatever those ponies she'd seen weeks ago had been, they were nothing like the ones in Equestria. They hadn't even talked. They haven't even talked to her. Lyra idly inspected her fingers. She could always do what she'd done with Bon Bon in that final week. If she didn't mention unicorns, maybe she could convince Audrey she was over it, that she wasn't crazy. She knew even less about this world than she thought. She'd been in some place called America all this time, judging by Audrey's reaction. France was still real, but Lyra had no idea exactly how far away it was. It didn't sound like it was anywhere close. She let out a sigh. What was she supposed to tell her real family? Audrey found her dad working in the living room at his laptop. She approached him slowly. This would have to be handled delicately. Hey, Dad. Yes? He didn't look up. I know it's kind of out of nowhere, but we found Lyra's parents, she said. He stopped typing immediately and turned his head around. You're sure? Audrey nodded. She went on to explain everything about how one of Lyra's friends from the band recognized her dad, the news article they'd found, the entire story, excluding the conversation that she'd just had with Lyra. The story was insane enough already without her help. I'm not sure how nobody figured it out before. Thomas McClacos. Ever heard of him? I guess he's fairly popular. I don't recognize him, but you're sure it's him. I don't see how nobody would have. Why they didn't recognize him? Audrey said. Well, Lyra had a perfect explanation for that. I don't know either, but the picture matched up, and there were news stories about her disappearance that matched her age. I don't think we can really say anything for sure, but it seems very likely. Let me see it before we make any decisions, he said. And she hasn't said anything about where she's been. Yeah, she wasn't kidnapped at all. She's been living in a magical land with unicorns. No worries there. Everything was all sunshine and rainbows. But instead, all Audrey had told him was, no, still nothing. I still think that something might have happened to her, like... He nodded. Nothing needed to be said. They discussed this possibility plenty of times. And Lyra still won't say anything. You showed her what you found, right? Of course, she said she didn't remember anything about it. They were both quiet for some time. But Audrey. Yes? If this doesn't turn out to be her family, we'll need to do something about Lyra. She's a good kid, but she can't stay here much longer. I know that. I just need to finish this up and I'll be up there to look at what you found. She headed back upstairs to wait. The light from the computer screen shined on Audrey's face in the dark room. It was late at night. Her mom had checked out what they'd found, too. She'd heard of a book series Lyra's dad wrote, though she'd never read any of them herself. High fantasy wasn't her preference. But everything about that story of Lyra McClacos' disappearance 15 years ago seemed to line up. Now it was just a matter of getting in touch. Lyra had told her to handle it since she had no idea what email even was. Why did she have to go and make things so much more complicated, though? She had actually been getting better up until now. The first time Audrey had met her, Lyra had been completely hopeless, a total wreck. It had just been Audrey's attempt at a good deed, letting her stay for a few days. That had turned into weeks. But a girl like that, obviously a runaway, alone in a moderately big city, that was asking for trouble. Who knew where Lyra would be by now if Audrey hadn't stepped in? If she'd even be alive, that might be pushing it, actually, but not impossible. It had been hard enough to convince her parents that this random green-haired stranger was who would occasionally try to eat flowers wasn't a total lunatic. They would not hear anything about unicorns. Audrey would would have to make sure of that. The more of this she could convince them to let her handle on her own, the better. Asking her about Lyra's past straight out hadn't gotten her far at first. Audrey had thought maybe building some trust could get her talking, and that it had. So Lyra thought she had come from Ponyville. Creative name, must have spent a long time on that one. And that she'd been a unicorn. And now she'd been turned into a human by a magic princess and was trying to fit into human society. There were worse illusions, for sure, more dangerous ones, but that was a doozy. Audrey's first suspicion of child abuse couldn't be completely counted out. If anything, they seemed more likely. Assuming she was Lyra McClacos, there was enough to indicate that, and she'd been kidnapped as an infant. Who knew where she had been? She was blocking the memories. She must be... Something in her behavior in her behavior when she opened up about her little secret said that she believed every word that was coming out of her mouth. When they had first met, she'd thought Lyra was interesting. And yes, she was interesting, all right. Audrey put her head on her hands and groaned. The sooner she was done with this, the better. Audrey tapped the spacebar impatiently to wake her computer up. She opened up the browser and went back to Thomas McClacos' official website. The page was just a flashing ad for his book series. The guy had built his fortune out off of fantasy worlds, and Lyra thought she had come from one. Was this really the place to send her? Even if it was her real family. On one book, she acted like she didn't want to be a unicorn. On one hand, she acted like she didn't want to be a unicorn, considering whatever those years in Ponyville had actually been. It made sense that she would want to get away from it. Her goal was to find her parents and become a normal human. It didn't sound too harmful. And on the other hand, she thought she was a unicorn. Of all things, a unicorn. What was the proper response to that, anyway? Lyra needed help, as long as her delusions weren't dangerous. Therapy, medication, probably expensive stuff. Sending her halfway across the country might not be the best thing right now. But it wasn't like Audrey's family could provide any help. And now Lyra had her own family to take care of her, assuming she could reach them. It took a lot of digging through the site, but Audrey finally found a link on the page to the author's email, probably just for fan letters and that sort of thing. But there was no other way to get in touch. Her parents had discussed this with her, what she should do, what she should tell him. She spent a good few minutes typing out a message, and read it over a few times. She didn't exactly want it to sound like a school paper. Was it too formal? Not enough? She tried to phrase the part about Lyra's issues mildly. If she sounded too crazy, she could threaten the one part of the story that actually might be true. Mr. McClacos, my name is Audrey Lauren. I am 16 years old and live in Des Moines, Iowa. Several weeks ago I met a girl my age passing through town who called herself Lyra. She's currently staying in my home and working as an amateur musician. She has no known last name and said she was searching for her birth parents after discovering that she was adopted. It was not until very recently that we identified you and your wife in the photograph Lyra carried with her. She has never heard of you, but her name and her age match those of your missing daughter. Lyra refuses to tell me anything truthful about her past or who her former caretakers were. She seems to be suffering from delusions and may need medication or professional help. Audrey paused on the part at the moment. It would be best not to mention just how severe those delusions were. This guy's daughter had been abducted and he hadn't seen her in years. There was no way to lift in, by the way, she told me she was a unicorn and not have it sound like a cruel joke. I understand that when your daughter went missing 15 years ago, several objects were stolen. If this photograph is one of them, I see no other way she could have obtained it. Please respond. Attached to the message was a photo she'd taken of Lyra's picture frame. Audrey didn't have a scanner, and besides, the frame might help identify it. Prove that the picture hadn't been copied. She also included a picture of Lyra herself. I hope to God you actually check this thing, Audrey muttered. Hit send. It had been a few days since they'd found her parents. Lyra was starting to get uncomfortable in this house. At the moment, she was just sitting on the bed with her guitar, not playing it. She hadn't even plugged it in. She was starting to spend a lot of time alone, just thinking. Audrey's parents had started asking her what she remembered about her adopted family, and Lyra had noticed Audrey's face whenever they brought it up. She hadn't said anything about Equestria since their conversation. Audrey had practically begged her not to. They were still hospitable enough, but the question had starting again. Lyra was just wanting to get back to Philadelphia, she corrected herself, and live the normal human life she'd been dreaming of. She had been pretending that was what she'd had here, but really, she had been an outsider for the past few weeks. Now she finally had solid ties to the human world. Well, maybe they still hadn't. Maybe. They still hadn't. I got no reply back. She stared up at Audrey, who had just stepped into the doorway. Something about her facial expression said that things weren't going as planned. From my dad? What did he say? Lyra asked, frowning. She set her instrument down to the side. Audrey took a seat next to her. Her arms were folded, and she stared at her lap. Well, first off, he's not entirely convinced you're his daughter. Lyra leaned forward. What? But everything on your computer said they'd been searching for you for years after your disappearance. Obviously, they wanted their daughter back, but eventually they gave up on hope that you were alive, Audrey said. But you're not the first person who's claimed that to be Lyra McLachos. You mean somebody pretended to be me? Why? He's got a missing daughter and a lot of money. You do the math, Audrey said. He doesn't want to put his family under too much strain, but he was interested in the picture. Nothing from your disappearance was ever recovered, but he said that picture was one of the things missing. Lyra gave a sigh of relief. See? I told you. That should be prove everything right. Nothing can really be taken for granted until they get a DNA test, but first he wants to talk to you. He gave me a phone number, Audrey said. A phone number? Lyra remembered what those were, like what she'd used to talk to Randall the first time. So I can talk to him with that, right? That's kind of what it's for, yes. Just don't say anything crazy to him, alright? You mean about Equest? Yes, that. Nothing about that. Lyra laughed nervously. No, of course not. I know, I'm not a unicorn. I was kidding, that's all. So are you going to tell your family where you've been for the past 15 years? I'm sure they'd like to know. Well, Audrey shook her head. Whatever you decide to tell them, just remember that you're still on thin ice. The last thing you need is for them to think you're just trying to take advantage of them. I'd never do that. Lyra, in spite of everything, I just still trust you. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe you are crazy. Audrey handed her a small piece of paper. This is the number he sent me. All you can do right now is talk to him. The phone was in one hand, and the slip of paper was in the other. Lyra thought she remembered how to enter the code into the device. The operation had been pretty straightforward. Still, it was her second time ever talking on the phone. The last time had been a while ago, not to mention she'd be talking to her dad for the first time ever. She took a deep breath. She'd been watching the family relations between Audrey and her parents. They got along well, for the most part, but Audrey had always been a human and had known them for her whole life. This human, and that was part of it. He was a human. Was like a total stranger to her. She hadn't felt this way about talking to a human since the first time she'd met one. Lyra gritted her teeth and punched in each number. Hi. There was no response, just periodic buzzes. Hello, is anybody... Hello? Who's this? The man's voice came from the small device unexpectedly. She froze, but finally found her voice again. My name's Lyra, she said it softly and waited for a response. He didn't say anything either. After a moment, she continued. Are you Thomas McLachos? Yes. His voice suddenly dropped low. Maybe he was just as nervous as she was right now. He said nothing for a while, and then... I read the email about you. Oh, you did? She was finding it just as difficult to say anything. Your friend told me. Audrey, yeah. She sent a letter. I don't know how to use a computer. She gave a short, nervous laugh. Another long pause. How long have you had that photograph? Ever since I was young. I never knew who you were. Another friend of mine read your books. He told me about your books, the ones about magic. Lyra. There was something strange about the way he said her name, like he wasn't used to saying it anymore. Where have you been all these years? That question had been inevitable. It was only right for him to want to know, and yet he probably wouldn't believe her. And if her family, her only solid connection to this world, and her only permanent home, if they abandoned her, she'd have nothing. She remembered the night that Dewey had shown her that picture. It was one of her final nights in Equestria. After seeing those humans, not even knowing who they were, staying in Equestria didn't seem like an option. And now she was talking to a man from her picture. If she wanted to live there in Pennsylvania, then it would be best to put Equestria in the past permanently. To tell you the truth, she scratched her head, I don't remember what happened to me. The email said you were confused about it. Yeah, Larry's voice trembled. It's all kind of a blur. The phone went silent again. Then, are you alright? Of course. Nothing bad happened to me, but I don't remember very much from before I came to Des Moines. Audrey and her family took me in for a while before that. I don't remember how I got here. It sounded weak, and she realized that. She just didn't know enough about the human world to come up with a convincing lie, even though she'd been pondering it over the past few days. She didn't even know what America was like, even if she was right in the middle of it. You don't remember anything? He asked. I wish I did. Her legs moved restlessly. The strangest thing about talking on a phone was that you couldn't see the other human. What they were doing, what they looked like, that was only making it harder to talk to her father. So, green hair, huh? What? What? Lara glanced around, but she was alone in the room. How did he know? Your friend Audrey sent me a picture of you. You aren't what I expected, to say the least. The good humor in his voice sounded forced. That much was clear without even being able to see him. Yeah, I guess not. Lara smiled weakly. The other humans all thought she dyed her hair. She actually didn't know what color hair she was supposed to have. Green obviously wasn't what she'd been born with. Her parents would know, but not her. And you're a musician. Am I remembering this right? Yeah, guitar mostly. There was yet another long silence. I saw you write books about magic. Yes, I suppose you could say that. But there's much more to fantasy these days than just magic. I'm not really interested in that, Lyra said. You might be the odd one out, then. My wife does artwork. A lot of it is for my books, and your sister, well, she's... Ever since Audrey had mentioned her while reading the information off the computer, Lyra had been curious about her sister. What's her name? Lyra leaned forward. It's Chloe. I'd like to meet her. Lyra smiled. She'd always been used to having been an only child. But she was good with younger fillies. Her sister was probably around the same age as the Cutie Crusaders. I haven't told either of them about you yet. It's just... She heard him sigh. Lyra, I really would like to trust you, but we can't be too careful. You're not lying about where you got that picture. Of course not. I really have had it ever since I can remember. You said you didn't remember anything. Well, not everything. But that picture, I've definitely had it for 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 a few weeks. For years, she said instead. Well, Dewey had kept it for years, and where else would he have gotten a photograph of humans? Besides, it wasn't like they were going to tell her the truth. Up until the end, they just wanted her to be a regular unicorn. Hadn't they realized that would have been impossible? If you could just tell me what happened, where you'd gone after, well... I can't. I'm sorry. Neither of them said anything. Then he spoke again. Would you be able to come here to Pennsylvania? Huh? I think so. Lyra had no clue where that was in relation to Des Moines. But it would probably be possible to get there somehow. You mean, you do trust me? I may be getting my hopes up. I really don't have anywhere else to go. Thank you so much, she whispered. One final thing. Would I be able to talk to the family you're staying with? Sure. I'll go find somebody. Do I just give the phone to them? I'm sorry, I'm new at this. That's fine. She lowered the phone from her ear. She supposed she could walk around with it until she found one of Audrey's parents. There seemed to be a certain etiquette humans follow when using these that she'd observed but never understood. But more importantly, she's finally going home.